For 300 years, man tried to conquer this little strip of land in Southern America. Conquering the strip of land meant joining the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. You do this and you control the world's trade. For 300 years, nations had failed, until a certain US president, he decided to try something a little bit different. You see, the result of conquering nature was the Panama Canal. This right here is one of man's greatest engineering achievements. We are talking about a man-made waterway, 82 kilometers long, that joins the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. This marvel is situated in South America, specifically Panama. This is right between Costa Rica and Colombia. The creation of this resulted in drastically quicker trade routes. We're talking about 5 months saved when traveling from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Now, really, before we dig into the history of the Panama Canal, we need to understand a few key things. These will be referenced on a little bit later. You see, there were two designs that were originally proposed. First, we've got the sea level design, then we have the lock canal design. Now, the design was originally conceived by Adolphe Codin de Lepine and designed by the Committee Technique of the Compagnie Nouvelle de Canal de Panama. Now, until the United States came in, the sea level design was the only one that was really pushed for. However, a massive oversight was that the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, there are two different elevations. One is higher than the other. The sea canal would never work, it was not practical. You see, the oceans are at different levels, and to equalize them, you would have to remove an impossible amount of earth. A lock design was just better. You see, the lock design worked through gravity. You see, there were 12 locks in total, 6 pairs, 3 on each side. The Pacific side had the Pedro Miguel locks, the Miraflores locks, and the Cocoli locks. Keep in mind, the Cocoli locks were added in later on in 2016. On the Atlantic side, you had the Gatun locks, and you had the Aqua Clara locks. The Aqua Clara locks were again added in 2016. Now, you see, the locks were essentially gates that led to a chamber that would fill up with water. These were powered by electric motors within the lock walls. The lock chambers measure at 34 meters wide and 320 meters long. So how does it work? Before the vessel enters the first chamber, the locks, or the gates in this case, they open up. The vessel enters in and water starts to pour in from culverts on the base of the chamber. The water pouring in is controlled from valves within the culverts. The water fills in to match the water level of the next chamber. Once the water levels are aligned, the vessel continues into the next chamber, and then this process carries on until they hit Gatun Lake. From then on, the vessel travels across the lake towards the other set of locks, where the process is repeated in reverse. Now, this happens until the vessel is back at sea level. It's an ingenious design that uses nothing but gravity. Let's dig into its history. You see, it's the 16th century, so the 1700s. The explorer Vasco Núñez de Balboa realized you could take a cheeky little shortcut from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean if you simply removed this little bit of land that separated the two oceans. This little bit of land is called the Isthmus of Panama. It was so simple. Dig the isthmus away, join the oceans, Bob's your uncle. Accomplishing this would be what Ethernet is to dial-up internet. However, this was the 16th century, and Balboa soon realized that they just did not have the technology to undertake this. It is now 1698. The Scots come into the scene. They saw the potential of the region. They understood if you control this region, you control trade. They attempted to colonize the region under the Darien scheme. It was a publicly funded venture. We're talking about $400,000 back then was raised. At the time, this was almost half of Scotland's capital. The first expedition set sail and arrived at Panama on November 1698. The English colonies at the time were instructed to not trade with the new settlement. A bit of nastiness was going on behind the scenes. This, paired with the conditions of Panama and conflicts with both the Spanish and the English, meant many settlers had passed away. 16 ships had sailed. Only one returned. The Darien scheme ruined Scotland, to the point that it may have even led to Scotland forming a union with England. In 1811, the German naturalist Alexander von Humboldt comes to the scene. He studies the area and he concludes that the mountains of Panama are far too big to create a canal. No bueno, it's a dead end. And he does note that you would have to remove a significant amount of mountain range for this to even be feasible, to even connect the oceans together. The daring French now come onto the scene. It is 1875 and the Tourist Syndicate was formed. The Tourist Syndicate was also known as the Société Civile Internationale du Canal Interoceanique de Darien. And now this was formed for one purpose: to propose a canal across Panama. It took 2 attempts to convince the Colombian government to give them the green light. Eventually they got the rights, and the absolute mad lads gave it a crack. They knew the terrain was brutal, they knew disease was rampant, but they knew it would not be easy, and by God did they give it a fair go. Now the French went with the sea level design. They assumed if you removed the isthmus and you add a bit of infrastructure, the oceans would level out, that a sea level canal would simply work. It did not. Okay, so the French were given the green light based on the success of the Suez Canal. However, they did ignore glaring differences in the site conditions between the two. For one, the Suez Canal is more flat. It doesn't have the mountain range the way Panama did. Secondly, the ground composition of the Suez was entirely different. It was a lot more sandy, whereas the Isthmus of Panama featured a harder composition. Nonetheless, they proceeded. In 1881, construction started under the Company Universelle du Canal Interoceanique de Panama. Now the missile is really starting to ramp up. They believed it would cost them anywhere from 120 million to 214 million, with 8 years to finish the project. In reality, they stopped at 1889, spending 287 million. Overspending from underestimating the difficulty of the area ruined the project, not to mention countless lives that were lost in this endeavor due to the diseases of the area. This was namely malaria and yellow fever. Now, I've suffered from yellow fever, but nothing like this. No one could do it. It was too expensive, too difficult. There were too many obstacles. The Yanks had heard whispers of the French's courageous endeavor. They believed they could do it, and so they picked up the project in 1904. They bought the project off the French, inheriting the existing infrastructure and resources. They essentially got a half-complete project. They came in and they did change a few things. For one, they went with the lock design over the original sea-level design. Okay, so they got the project, were opting for a different design. Well, what else? They brought in new plant. This included steam shovels, steam-powered cranes, rock crushers, concrete mixers, dredges, and pneumatic power drills. Additionally, they also got new infrastructure. Now, really the US had to figure out how to tackle the many issues of the area. The geographical conditions of the area were brutal. The rock was hard to excavate. Even now, when you are undertaking any form of earthworks, you need to consider the ground conditions. What is the composition of the ground? How easy is it to actually remove? The geography of the area also wasn't great. It was the tropics, rainforest everywhere. And when there's rainforest, there's a fuck ton of rain and a lot of mosquitoes. Brutal climate conditions with unrelenting humidity and being in an area that is nigh accessible. The Changres River would flood harder than the missus after a haircut. This was one of the driving forces behind implementing the lock design over the sea level. Considering the Yanks had inherited the French infrastructure, it wasn't in the best shape. So the chief engineer, John Frank, rebuilt and improved upon the inherited infrastructure. such as the Panama Canal Railway. This was going to be used by the future workers. Not to mention disease was rampant in the area caused by mosquitoes, namely malaria and yellow fever. You see, at the time, they believed the ground was emitting toxic fumes. That's what caused these diseases. Unfortunately, medicine wasn't quite yet evolved. However, soon enough, it came to light that these diseases were caused by those nasty little bastards the whole time. William C. Gorgas was brought in as the chief sanitation officer of the area. He had one task: annihilate the mosquito population. And he did exactly that. He removed all still water from the area wherever he could. He then produced mass solutions of toxic oils and fumes and completely decimated the mosquito population. All of this led to greatly reduced disease numbers. New chief engineer comes in, George Washington Goethals. He comes in and he has a methodology for the canal. 3 divisions: the Atlantic, the Central, and the Pacific. The Atlantic had the breakwater at the entrance, the Gatun locks, and the approach to the channel, and the Gatun Dam. The Pacific Division had the breakwater in Panama Bay, the approach channel to the locks, the Miraflores locks, and the Pedro Miguel locks. The Central Division saw the excavation of the Culebra Cut, big bloody explosives. The Gamboa Dike was this massive bit of land that we needed to remove. This was a barrier between defeat and victory. Okay, so we have a way forward, we know what we need to do, we just need to get started. The locks at the Pacific and the Atlantic were made entirely of concrete. This was the first time concrete was used to this extent. The locks were built. It was now all up to the Central Division. This is it. We are now in the final stretch. Explosives were set up. President Woodrow Wilson sat in the Oval Office in the big old White House, and he pushed that red button, and that sent a signal. Water screamed in. Earthworks of the grandest scale had occurred. 2 oceans were joined. The Panama Canal became a reality. It took $500 million to get this done. Could you imagine what you could do with a Blue Dolphin with that? In total, it took 10 years for the United States to complete the Panama Canal. 18 years if you count the legwork the French had already undertaken. From concepts in the 16th century to its execution in the 20th. Man achieved. This is engineering of the grandest scale. And it only makes you wonder what else has been done, what other engineering marvels have been undertaken in the world's history. See you in the next one.